materials, labor, and overhead costs are added to the product. Oh, look at that on page 157. They show raw materials, wages payable, all manufacturing overhead is all being put into all the work in process. There's two work in process accounts. One is for Department A, the other's for Department B. And then so the product gets started being built in Department A. And then once that's done for Department A, they transfer it to Department B. So they would have to debit work in process, Department B. And if the cost that they're transferring out on the units is 50,000, that's what you would debit. And you would credit work in process dash Department A because it's no longer in Department A. Those costs have been transferred to the second department. Then they're finished, they're going to be transferred to finished goods inventory. And then when they sell it, it becomes an expense. Wow. Oh, and then there's those journal entries starting on page 158. Oh, it's just like job order costing. We have materials, we have direct materials, we're putting it into production. Direct materials, we're going to debit work in process. And whatever department it is, that's for the formulating, and you credit raw materials. And then you would have direct labor, and then you would have manufacturing overhead applied to each work in process department, probably using different allocation base. All right, and so on it goes. So let's go to the weighted average method example. Yes. And look, on the bottom page 160, they summarize it. Step 1, compute the equivalent units of production. Step 2, compute the cost per equivalent unit. Step 3, assign cost to units. You assign cost to the units transferred out, and you assign cost to the ending work in process. They're in the ending work in process because it doesn't have all the direct material costs, or it might not have all the direct labor costs, might not have all the overhead costs. That's why they stayed behind in the ending work in process. Only if it has all costs, then it would be transferred out. I see. And then let's take a look at, they're showing step 1 on page 162. You get your weighted average method. There's a separate calculation is made for each cost category and each processing department. So each cost category could be direct materials, direct labor, manufacturing overhead. But in this textbook, they use a lot where they just break it into two: direct material cost and conversion cost. Conversion cost consists of direct labor and our manufacturing overhead costs. So look what they did there in the middle of the page, the shaping and milling department. They showed the number of units, the percentage completed. So in the beginning work in process inventory, they had 200 units. For the materials, they had 55% of all the direct materials they're going to have in those units. Oh, so they got to add more direct material costs this current period. And also, for conversion costs, it only has 30% of the conversion cost. Units started into production during May was 5,000 units. Units completed during May and transferred to the next department, 4,800. I want you to write this in your notes or star it in the book and say, put this down in your notes. Every unit transferred out has to be transferred out completely finished as far as that department is concerned. So they're going to be transferred out when they've been completed. You got that? They're always going to be transferred out at 100%. Do you see the 4,800 units? 100% of the direct materials are in there, and 100% of the conversion costs are in there. But in the ending work in process, they had 400 units, but only 40% of the direct material costs were in there, and only 25% of the conversion cost. So that's step number 1. but I want to add. I want to add a step. So I'm going to show you when we get to a problem that we're going to be doing in class. But you have this example here to follow. Okay, everybody understand step one, computing the equivalent units. Equivalent units for the goods transferred out, they get 100%. But in the ending work in process, you got to read what it is. For materials, there's 400 units that are 40%, has 40% of the direct material cost. So they don't have 60% of the 100%. They only got 40. So you have to take that percentage, 40% times how many units? 400. 40% times 400, that gives you 160 equivalent whole units. So if we could do one and completely have all the direct material in it at one time, they're saying there's 400 has only 40% of all direct material costs. But if we could make them one at a time, we would, all we do is we take the percentage times the number of units and we multiply it. So that gives us 160 equivalent units. So the 400, that's partially got only 40% of the direct material cost. Well, if we multiply 40% times 400, that would only be 160 equivalent units. If we could do one unit at a time, we would have had 160 units. So that's how they get equivalent units. You got to know which percentage you're multiplying. Under first in, first out, you would have to be concerned with the beginning work in process, Greg. You would have to be concerned because you would have to use that percentage. But under the weighted average, you're just focused in on the ending work in process. They don't worry about what costs were last time period. They just take those in and they average them out. Because what happens, you take the costs from the beginning work in process, and the cost this time period could be different. Could be different for direct material and for some conversion cost. So anyways, the first in, first out method is probably considered a little bit more accurate, but it's close enough for what we need to do. It's acceptable too for determining ending inventory. All right. So at the top page 163, this is still the shaping and milling department. So the units transferred to the next department, 4,800 units. Oh, I see. That was right there. Equivalent units in ending work in process. Materials, 400 units in the ending, but they're only 40% of the way completed. That means there's only 160 equivalent whole units. You getting this? And then conversion costs, they tell us we got 400 units in the ending, but it has only 25% of all conversion costs that it will end up with. We multiply then the 25% times 400 units. So the equivalent units for conversion just in the ending work in process is 100. So how do you get the total equivalent units for materials? You take the 4,800 that were transferred out. They had to have had all the direct material cost in those units or they wouldn't have been transferred to the next department. The conversion cost, it would have had all the manufacturing overhead that it needed and it would have had all the direct labor. So those units, the units transferred out, are transferred out at 100%. But in the ending inventory, based on the percentages they tell you they have in that product, as far as direct materials and conversion costs, you take those percentages, multiply the number of units in the ending work in process, and that's the equivalent units for material costs and then for conversion costs. Then you add the units transferred out plus the equivalent units in the ending work in process. So for materials, in this example, Exhibit 4.6, we have 4,960 equivalent whole units. For conversion, it's only 4,900 equivalent units. Any questions thus far? Vanessa, you got it now? Did you understand it before?
Yeah, but that was nice to be able to have it clarified.
Okay, I'm glad I could do that. Step two, compute the cost per equivalent unit. So you got to take the cost in the beginning work in process. For materials, it was 9,600. For conversion costs, it was 5,575. The total cost that are in the beginning work in process is 15,175. You need to add costs this time period to complete those units. And they added total costs of 368,600 for direct material costs. Conversion costs are 350,900, which totals 719,500. And then you get the total direct material cost of $378,200. You get the total conversion costs totaling 356,475. You add those together and you get the total cost of $734,675 used in production. Okay? That would be direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. So, step two, they showed in Exhibit 4 8, but that's not the complete step for step two. The complete step is the paragraph, or not the paragraph, but the example above step three. Look, shaping and milling, the cost per equivalent units. We have 9,600 for the beginning. Oh, that's the cost. Yes. And so the total cost for direct materials $378,200. And now you're going to divide it by the equivalent units that you calculated in step one. So turn the page back, turn the page back to exhibit 4 6. Materials are showing equivalent units of production of 4,960. So you divide that into the total cost of your direct materials for the time period, you're going to cost out each equivalent whole unit at $76.25 for direct material costs. But for conversion costs, you take the cost in the beginning work in process inventory. You're going to add cost added during the time period. The total cost $356,475. And then you got to go back to exhibit 4 6 and you read the column that says conversion. So the units transferred out, they got to be transferred out at whole units, 4,800. And then you have another 100 units in the ending work in process inventory. So then that that's going to be added to the 4,800. That gives you 4,900 equivalent units for conversion costs. Do you see that toward the bottom, page 164 for materials? The equivalent units is 4,960. For conversion, it's 4,900. Those numbers were calculated in step one, determining the equivalent units of production. And if you go back to 163, you see again units transferred out to the next department. They got to be transferred out at equivalent whole units. But then the units that were that we had, 400 units times 40%. That's how many equivalent whole units for direct material costs. But direct labor and manufacturing overhead, that's our conversion cost. There's 400 units, but only 25% of the way completed. So 25% times 400, that's 100. 100 units, equivalent units. So now do you see where they got those numbers? And then they simply used third grade division and they divided it to get the cost per equivalent unit. So step one was to determine equivalent units. We have to use step one to finish step two. Step two is taking the cost in the beginning work in process, adding cost added during the time period. That gives you total cost. Divided by the equivalent units, you get your cost per unit. Any questions with that?
We need a double underline total costs on those, correct?
You can, you can.
Okay.
I like to because it draws my attention to them because I'm going to need to know the cost per unit in step three when I'm assigning cost to units. I'm either going to assign the cost to the units transferred out, or I'm going to assign the cost to the ending work in process. So look at the top of page 165, shaping and milling department, cost of ending work in process, inventory and units transferred out. So they start with the ending work in process inventory. Oh, equivalent units. Oh, it was 160 for both materials and no, and the conversion was 100. Okay. And they got units completed and transferred out. Oh yeah, that was good. All right. Questions? Pretty quiet class. I'm not sure if they're understanding it or not. It's hard to read blank stares at me. Justin, you usually have something good to say. What do you say?
I'm just kind of waiting for an example so I can see how it all flows together.
Oh, so you're not 100% on this yet, are you?
No, usually doing it.
Oh, you follow the old, if you do it 80%, you're going to know 80% of it. But if you just hear about it, you might remember 10%. So that's what's going right now. You don't have it solidified in your mind. You don't feel very confident. But let's look at step 4, the prepare a cost reconciliation report. So you got to account for the cost in the beginning work in process and cost added. So you add that up. That's how much you have to account for. Total cost to be accounted for, $734,675. They double underline that, Vanessa, because when they account for the cost as follows: costs that are in the ending work in process, it's 19,475. How the heck did we get that? That's up on top of page 165, isn't it? So we're talking about cost of ending work in process. So you go to the ending work in process. There's 160 equivalent units for materials, and the cost per unit is $76.25. If we multiply that by 160 equivalent whole units, that would be $12,200 cost of ending work in process for direct material costs. And then the conversion cost, you would end up with 100 units times the $72.75. That's $7,275. If you add them both together, that gives you $19,475. All right. So at the bottom page 165, they show, hey, we accounted for the cost. The cost we had to account for is $734,675. And the cost accounted for as follows: we had the cost in the ending work in process, and we added the units transferred out, and that we get the total cost accounted for. Everybody good? All right. And then they summarize the chapter, don't they? Operating cost. So let's see what problem we should do, or should we do an exercise? Is 15 one that we have to do for homework? Is it?
Yeah. No,
Oh, is it?
we have to do P415, P416, and P417.
Wow, that's 3 problems. What if I just show you the answers to those? Would that help you? Wow, there's 15. Let's see, here's 16. Wow, there's a lot of numbers, isn't it? Oh man.
Can't really see anything with all your scribbling all over this.
I didn't scribble. I don't know who did that scribbling. It's an interesting phenomenon. I'll have to do something about that. Maybe that was this. That's autofocus. That didn't do anything. That didn't do anything either. I don't know what that is. I'll have to talk to those IT guys and see what all that scribbling is, because it must be up in the camera somehow or something. But
No, it's from a student.
it's from a student?
Yeah, it says keeps going in and out. I think they're talking about the transmission.
The transmission is going in and out?
It might be in a remote area.
Okay.
I don't know how you read that.
Is that what it says when you read it?
It looks like my handwriting, that's all.
Oh, that's why you can read it, because it's your handwriting. Are you in a remote area? Well, Paige, some people
I'm
would say
not,
that's kind of remote.
If I was in a remote area, that's probably how I would write. I'm just
All right, let's see here. Maybe we can do one of these. Should we do 15 or should we do another one besides 15? Oh, comprehensive. Oh, here's something. Maybe we should look at this one. Exercise 4.1. It's on page 172. Let's follow along here. Quality Brick Company produces bricks in 2 processing departments. They have a molding department and a firing department. Information related to the company's operations in March follows. Raw materials used in production. The molding department, $23,000 of raw materials. The firing department, $8,000. Direct labor costs incurred in the molding, $12,000. In the firing department, $7,000. Manufacturing overhead. Oh, those are the 3 manufacturing costs. Ooh, I see. But the manufacturing overhead applied in the molding department was $25,000. The firing department was $37,000. Unfired molded bricks were transferred from the molding department to the firing department. So they were molded, but they weren't fired yet. According to the company's processing costing system, the cost of unfired molding bricks was $57,000. Finished bricks were transferred from the firing department to the finishing goods department. According to the company's process costing system, the cost of finished bricks was $103,000. Finished bricks were sold to customers. According to the company's process costing system, the cost of finished bricks sold was $101,000. Prepare journal entries to record the items A through F. So what would be the first one in A? Oh, this is just like job order costing, right? You're determining what journal entry, what account needs to be debited, what needs to be credited. Does anybody have an idea there in A?
You debit work in process molding.
For how much? How much?
23,000.
That's the direct material cost?
I said you debit work in process molding.
Yeah, but what does that represent? Is that the direct material cost, the direct labor cost, or is that manufacturing overhead?
Raw materials.
Raw materials. But you don't know if they're direct or indirect, do you?
Direct.
How do you know they're direct? Do they tell you that's direct or what?
Because you can see it's part of the final product.
Where do you see it at? Is it in the words you're seeing that or what?
It's from a previous chapter when it explained what direct labor or direct materials was.
Yeah, but it doesn't say it's direct materials. It says raw materials used in production. Jeepers creepers. Well, the finished bricks were transferred from the firing, to the finished goods warehouse. So what would you debit, Greg? You have an inkling. You want to debit something. Do you want to debit direct materials? Is that what you want to do?
No, I said debit work in process molding for 23,000.
And what would the work in process firing be?
And then debit raw materials for the same amount.
Oh, you're going to debit the account raw materials?
Yeah.
Huh. I thought you debit the work in process account if it's direct materials.
No, you
Credit.
debit work in process molding, and then you credit raw materials.
Oh, so you're saying it is direct materials then, aren't you?
Yeah.
All right. That's the only thing I don't like about the problem. We've said that it was all raw material costs.
And then you do a work in process firing for 8,000.
So you made 2 separate, you're telling me you made 2 separate journal entries. You didn't want to do a compound journal entry and combine them?
Well, it says that each department has a different work in process account.
Oh, they do. Well, can you enter it into the accounting records? Oh, they did do a compound journal entry. They debited work in process molding department, 23,000. They debited work in process firing department, 8,000. They credited raw materials. They can make it just one entry. Ah, that's the way Vanessa's thinking. She's trying to be efficient, save time. There's not enough time in life. And who wants to eat up your life doing accounting all the time?
Nope.
All right. And then what
31.
else? What happened? Okay, Vanessa's going to do the B. So tell us what you did for B.
I haven't done it yet.
Well, you're doing it now. You're doing it now. Read what it
Direct
says.
labor costs incurred to the molding department for 12,000 and firing department for 7,000.
Ah, so what are you going to debit? What are you going to credit?
So
Is it direct labor?
debit molding department for 12.
Debit molding department. How about work in process?
Oh.
Molding department. Work in process.
Work in
Remember?
process.
You got to remember work in process from chapter 3. Holy schmollies.
So 12,000 for work in process molding, and then work in process firing for 7,000.
Right. And what will you credit? What will the credit be to? Which
Well-
account?
Hmm.
Mm.
Direct labor costs incurred.
Did they say they paid the direct laborers at this point in time? Read it. What's it say?
Direct labor cost incurred.
Incurred.
Will
They
be
did-
salaries and wages payable?
You're right. Wages payable. Does that show up on your screen at all?
Oh yeah.
Oh, okay. But maybe you can't read it because somebody was in a remote area and they scribbled all over something.
Wages.
I think if you stop sharing your screen and then reshare it,
Oh, okay. So
it'll-
I'm going to be that kind of a guy. I'm going to quit sharing. Right. But now you want me to share again?
yeah, I think it'll get rid of it.
I hope so. Let's see if it did. Wow, you should teach. You know more about this than I do. Jeepers creepers.
Oh,
How hard would it be? You know how to do the technology. You just read the solution. Oh, you're supposed to debit work in process molding for 12,000, debit work in process firing for 7,000, credit wages payable. But then if a student says, "Oh, why do you do that?" then you might be in trouble. All right, Justin, is this starting to help you at all?
Yes, I usually learn by doing.
Okay. So why didn't you just start doing the homework right away?
I had some other homework to do.
Oh, yes,
Okay.
that's right.
Yay.
Accounting's not your only subject. Yes. Okay. And then what's C saying, Clarissa? I know you can't say it, but you could chat with somebody and they can. Oh, I hear something. Oh, that's my watch beeping. It's 2:10 right now. It's kind of like a warning, right? We started at 1. We go to 2:15. Is that right? Nobody knows?
yes.
That's right.
Yeah,
Oh, gosh, we better get going here. So in C, what are we doing? Now we have manufacturing overhead being applied. So we debit work in process. The other ones, the direct materials was at actual cost. The direct labor was at actual, but the overhead was at the applied amount. Ah, it's the same. And then what's happening here? We're transferring out from the molding department to the firing department. The work in process firing department's receiving these bricks that haven't been fired. They've been molded, but they're not fired. And the molding department no longer hangs on to those used bricks, those unfired bricks. And then you're done firing them and you're going to increase debit the finished goods inventory and credit the work in process firing department. And when you sell it, you got to show the cost of goods sold and credit finished goods. So those are very similar. You just have more than one work in process account. Now let's get to this is what you wanted. You wanted to get to in a good example.
Meat and the potatoes.
Yeah. Was it number 11? Let's go to 11, see how it goes. So comprehensive second production department weighted average. So this corporation produces fine paper in 3 production departments: pulping, drying, and finishing. In the pulping department, raw materials such as wood fiber and rag cotton are mechanically and chemically treated to separate their fibers. The result is a thick slurry of fibers. In the drying department, the wet fibers transferred from the pulping department are laid down on porous webs, pressed to remove excess liquid, and dried in ovens. In the finishing department, the dried paper is coated, cut, and spooled into reels. The company uses the weighted average method and the process costing system, and data for March for the drying department follows. So they tell us the work in process on March the 1st and March the 31st. So they had 5,000 in the beginning work in process, and on March the 31st is the ending work in process. And they give us the percentage completed for pulping and conversion, and they give us the pulping cost, they give us the conversion cost, they give us the units transferred to the next department, pulping cost added during March, and conversion costs. So no materials added in the drying department. Pulping cost represents cost of the wet fibers, we fiber it and all that. Now compute the drying department's equivalent units of production. Oh, how many units did we transfer out, class? Quickly, you got to
3,000.
determine that. Well, how many units did they have at the beginning?
5,000.
5,000. How many do they end up with?
8,000.
Oh, 5,000 beginning work in process, and they end up with 15,000. All right. Do they tell us how many units were transferred to the department?
Is that supposed to be 8,000 or is that really supposed to be 15,000?
Well, it says units, 8,000. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, I was looking at ending inventory.
Where are you looking at ending inventory? Where it
On
says work,
411?
where it says work in process inventory March the 31st,
Yes,
and it says 8,000.
right.
And what did you say it was?
Oh, I subtracted, not added.
You subtracted, not added. What did you subtract?
8 minus 5,
And what's that 3,000 represent?
3,000.
Yeah, what's that represent?
The number of products that they produced.
Equivalent units. Don't they tell us in 411? Units transferred to the next production department is how many units? It's given in that table. It's given in that table. Do you see it? It's toward the mid. It's right in the middle. Do you see it?
157,000.
How many did they transfer out? Did they transfer
157,000.
157,000 units out? Guess what? They got to be transferred out at 100%, right? 100% of the direct material costs and the conversion costs. All right. So which units are we going to use? The beginning or ending? Ending or beginning? We got to determine the equivalent units. Well, we know it's 100% of these units transferred, right? But how about, is it the beginning or ending? And we got to use the percentages in the beginning or ending. Which is it?
Ending.
It's ending, yes. How many units do we have in the ending?
8,000.
8,000. And as far as the direct materials, how much does it have in it? The pulping is the direct material. Has 100%. Has 100%. So the equivalent units for the pulping, the direct material costs, the equivalent units is 165,000 units. Remember, this is units, not dollars. The conversion, it doesn't matter if it's the direct materials or the conversion costs. The units transferred are transferred at 100%. It has all the direct material cost in them. It has all the conversion cost in them, or they wouldn't transfer it to the next department. The ones in the ending work in process, there's 8,000 units. Of that, 8,000 units had 100% of the pulping, which is the direct materials. But the conversion cost only had 25%. You got to multiply 25% times 8,000. So you got 2,000 equivalent units for ending work in process and 157,000 transferred out. So the equivalent units for conversion costs 159,000, but for pulping or the direct materials, it's 165,000. Can you see that, or is there something in the way? You can't see that. You
Nope.
should see it now. Do you see that now?
Yep.
Could you see it now?
Yes.
Okay. Because on my screen, I got something hiding it. I guess you guys don't see that part. Okay. That's step one. Step two, what cost do we have? Do they tell us the cost added during March? 31,300. Do they tell us the cost in the beginning? The cost, pulping cost and work in process, March 1st. That's the beginning. It's $4,800, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
There it is. How about conversion? Right below 4,800, they tell you it's 500. That's goes in the conversion cost. And how much cost did they add during the month of March? For conversion, they added 31,300. For the pulping or the direct material, 102,450. You add it together. What did you have in the beginning work in process? And what was added? If we were doing FIFO, then we'd have to take percentages in the beginning. But since we're doing weighted average, the only time we do that is in the ending work in process on equivalent units. So if that's the cost, part one is right there. You just drag that down. Here's the cost for pulping or direct materials. You divide 165,000 into 107,250, and guess what? You get 65 cents per unit, per equivalent unit. We have 165 equivalent units. So that's why we took that total number of equivalent units divided into the cost for pulping, and we get 65 cents per unit. We have pulping costs. Conversion cost, again, they gave us what they had in the beginning, what they added. Here's the total cost for that time period, divided by the equivalent units, which is in step one. You drag it down to step two, divide it, and you get 20 cents. Now, when you allocate it, you're allocating some of the cost to the ending work in process. So we have right there, equivalent units of production, 8 and 2, oh, 8,002 ending work in process. See how we're using the same information? We use the equivalent units in part 2 to get the cost per equivalent unit. Now we're using these the equivalent units in ending work in process for pulping and conversion. And now we're going to multiply it by the cost per unit. Holy schmolies. That's second grade or third grade multiplication. And then you add those two together, and that gives you your total costs in your ending work in process. Oh, so this is your cost in your ending work in process. And then we're going to figure out the costs that are transferred out. We transferred out 157,000 units, both pulping and conversion. You can add these two numbers together and get 85 cents and multiply it by 157,000, and you would get the same thing. 157,000. We just add 65 cents and 20 cents. We get 85 cents, and we would get 133,450. Or we could take 65 cents, multiply it's 102,050, 20 cents, and then that's 31,400. Add those together, and bingo dingo, you get the same thing. Questions there. That's 3 parts. And then the 4th part is to do what? We got to reconcile it. So how do we reconcile it? 2 parts. Which cost did we have to account for? We had to account for the cost in the beginning work in process plus the cost added. Oh, that's 139. That's stuff that we had. The cost in the beginning, add that, and add cost added. There's the total amount.
Can you
Now-
move your paper left?
What's that?
Move it left. Thank you.
And then where did the cost go out at? Well, you had costs that ended up in the ending work in process inventory, 5,600. See, in part 3, there it is. And then the cost transferred, 133,450. There's part 3 coming back into part 4. And this cost, that was what we had for Yeah, the cost in the beginning work in process. That was part 2. Okay, you got it? You got to do those 4 steps. You got a problem like that on exam 1. Any questions? Does it seem overwhelming or is it something you can handle?
You gotta practice it.
With
Yep,
practice, you get good at anything, right?
yep. Can we have those exercises and their solutions, emailed?
You have the exercises in your book, I believe.
Can we have the solutions?
Oh, you're asking for the solutions.
Yeah,
You mean you
Please.
didn't copy it down that quickly?
no,
All right, just send me an email. If nobody sends me an email, nobody's interested in getting it.
all right.
Okay, you got problems for next time. And then after that, you better start studying for the first exam. You want to get a good score on the first exam. You want to start off right. You don't want to fail the first exam. A lot of people do in the past. I'm hoping this is a different type of group of students, which I believe it is. This is a pretty darn good group of students. Most of you were in that accounting 255 class where only one person didn't make it through the class. That means they got below a C. Everybody else got a C or higher. We had a couple of A's in that accounting 255 class. That was a pretty bright class. Okay, and a lot of you guys are from that class, so hopefully we'll see good results. But I'm just telling you, usually I don't see good results. Craig, you better have good results.
All
Okay,
right.
don't let me down.